When I'm talking of the West Germanic languages themselves, they are able to be differentiated across their subdivisions thanks to their distinctive characteristics. Thus and therefore, unquestionable and indisputable evidence of their remarkable resemblance that renders their common origin indisputable and at the same time differentiates between them owing to those distinctive characteristics that I've just mentioned.
Yes, sir.
But let us not linger on generalities.
Oh, Professor, sir.
You seem to be enjoying this, that's even better.
Oh, yes, sir. I really am.
Don't worry, we will...
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Story. And it is with great excitement and pleasure that I sit with the cast of The Lesson, which premieres here at the Market Theatre tomorrow, which is the 12th of October. So please do get your tickets. Welcome, Adaptor and Director Homann.
Thank you.
And amazing cast members and performers, Hopkins and Lihle Ngubo. Thank you so much for being with us here today. The Lesson. What is the story of The Lesson? Can you just tell us a little bit about the plot, maybe without giving absolutely everything away?
So pretty much The Lesson is about a young student who comes to a university town, eager and excited to learn, and looks forward to really gaining more knowledge about the world that she lives in. And she goes into the professor's home for this lesson, and it starts off very calm and very engaging, and she's really excited. I mean, it's the professor, who is about to be the university, the chancellor, so it's, how many students actually really get the chance to have that one-on-one encounter, but that excitement quickly turned into something unexpected. Yeah, without giving much away.
And it's interesting you use the word "what's the plot," because strictly speaking, it's a play that sits within a kind of theatre known as theatre of the absurd, which is also a kind of theatre that is what we would call an anti-play, which is not plot-driven. So although there is a plot, there's a basic unfolding of a story because it's about a relationship.
How do you like it?
Oh, it's all right. It's very handsome. Kubukeka nje kuhle kakhulu. There's a nice park and a girls' boarding school, many statues.
Actually, it's an anti-play that kind of resists the idea that it has a unfolding plot. And it's interesting for that reason, I suppose.
What's it about for you, Graham?
It's about a hang of a lot of words that I've had to learn. I was saying to Greg just a while back that it has been the most challenging thing to learn.
Sure.
And the words are fundamental, aren't they, to any process? But it's been a huge challenge to get them under the belt.
It's also a play about making words at times meaningless.
Meaningless, yeah.
And in order to do that, there has to be quite a lot of them.
There has to be a lot of them, and they have to, the structure and content of them is often deliberately repetitive and meaningless. And so for the actor to master them, you have to almost construct your own superstructure, as it were, around it to hang it all on. So that's been interesting. It's been very good for my brain.
So it sounds like a big challenge. This play was written in 1951, right?
Yes. Well, first stage. I don't know if it was written in, but it was certainly first stage in 1951.
And we're in 2022. And here's a play, Absurdist piece. We're living in slightly absurdist times, I think.
Yeah.
And you've decided, I'm going to bring this play back from its little grave. I really hope it hasn't been living in a grave. But you're saying I'm going to bring it from the ashes, and I'm going to place it in the now in 2022. What do you think might be some of the relevance about this place, particularly within the South African context?
Yeah. Well, there are a few things to say about that. Firstly, the play was first staged in the shadow of the Second World War. So although we're no longer in the shadow of the Second World War, we are in the shadow of a war that's growing somewhere in the world. And so that's makes the play in some ways interesting and pertinent in itself. I think also we should consider the 2 years of the pandemic was certainly, again, I'm not trying to equate that to a world war that lasted 4 or 5 years, but it certainly was a time that destabilized an entire generation, entire world. and sort of forced us into spaces where we had to think about the meaning of life and what it means to exist and what it means to just try and live and try and survive. And so this kind of theatre and the time when it was originally written does have echoes of that. That said, and with all of that aside, actually the reason I was interested in the play was because of what happened 5 years ago, or just over 5 years ago, with the Roads Must Fall movement across the country. And I thought this play has a really interesting opportunity to say something about what it means to be a South African student going into a university space that does, in many ways, as much as that's been trying to be readdressed, as much that still has the legacy of colonialism as part of it, and the decolonizing project is all part of that. So I wanted to take the play's original context, and I've done quite a lot of changes to adapt the play into a contemporary setting, although the arc of the play and the structure of the play remains exactly the same. The context of the play is no longer 1951 post-war Europe. It's 2022 South Africa, and it's about a student who arrives at the small town and is excited to be there because she has great hope that she can learn and she can engage with knowledge and a culture that perhaps she recognizes is different to hers. But she arrives there excited that she feels like there's some value to get from that culture and that education.
One make.
1 and 1 make 2.
That's very good. You're extremely advanced in your study. You have very little difficulty passing the total doctorate.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear that, especially coming from you.
Let us proceed.
Although the play unravels in a way that takes her down a different path, and maybe she recognizes that, well, maybe it leads to kind of a sense that there's pros and cons of what it means to be a professor and a student in a South African university, certainly today, and how complicated that is.
Yeah. Lihle, your student years are not far behind you. You're fairly young, and then you get to play the student. Building a bit on what Greg has said, maybe just some commentary for you in terms of what your experience has been as a student in South Africa and how maybe you relate that with this character who is a student to this professor, with this play being located within 2022. Maybe if there's some things that you resonate with, some relevance that you have, or experiences that you've kind of borrowed from and then brought into this experience and this character.
There actually really is quite a lot that I have resonated with. I think I'll start off by saying, I think when someone steps into a university space, you are already expecting to start learning something that is different from you. And more than anything, I've always been a person who always wanted to understand how we can use each other's differences to further each other altogether. But sometimes it depends whether or not the other person is even willing to embrace your difference as well. And I think in the university aspect of things, that is a bit of a difficult relationship to have. And rather, there's one way of teaching, and there is just one narrative that is just given, and nothing else is ever really taken in. So then it always just becomes a bit of a regurgitation in terms of the teaching, and the students, us as students, we just take it in and we learn what we have to learn, then we go to the exam room and then we just pass, and you aren't really seen, if I can put it that way. More than anything, you're just a number. And it kind of becomes hard because then you're just like, okay, how do I even go as far as wanting to maybe, for example, have one-on-ones with the lecturer and be like, I want to sit down with you after class and I want to unpack this further beyond what I have to know for the exam, but just generally because I'm in this subject and I'm studying it and I chose it because I want to know more and I'm very passionate about it, and seeing how sometimes that relationship doesn't necessarily work because unfortunately maybe sometimes the lecturer is just like, but it's not necessarily something I maybe want to do, or there's just a part of me even being in this place that has exhausted me as well. And then you need to figure out that, okay, as a student, where do I also reach my lecturer at a point of not dehumanizing them and not just seeing them just as a lecturer who must give and must give and must give and must completely, nullify themselves as a human, because I think that's what causes the gap between lecturer and student.
There's spaces that are by design, and I mean like physically, the physical space of going into a lecture room is designed where there's a divide and where there's a sort of power and a hierarchy that kind of exists. And I think a lot of how teaching happens, not only in South Africa but across the world for certain cultures, has started to shift, because there's a recognition that learning is not a one-way thing. And learning also requires a sense of not necessarily democracy, but a sense of feeling comfortable in a space. And obviously you want to be challenged. Challenge is different, I think, to being uncomfortable. You can be challenged and you can be comfortable. And I think that those things, the spaces are not physically designed, even spatially, to allow that kind of warmth to happen. Often they're cold, alienating, distancing spaces that make you feel, as Lihle very rightly put it, make you feel like a number and anonymous.
Graham, I'm very interested in what you had to say about this, because you've been a teacher for many years. What do you think maybe might be some very helpful teaching methods that can help, eradicate some of these feelings and some of this discomfort and the lack of opportunity to say something, and to help people feel more, comfortable, less intimidated? Like how?
Well, I should correct you first of all in that I was a teacher many years ago. I wasn't a teacher for many years. I was a teacher for a very short period of time. I was a maths teacher in Pietermaritzburg at Alexandra High School, teaching high school maths, but it wasn't a place that I wanted to be. Maths is a particularly difficult subject, and it comes up, it comes up in this play, in that it deals with absolute defined certainties. Whereas my other subject is English, which was very much in broad variables and a discussion about communication and about thinking. And I think those two poles actually represent the two extremes. One where there's one way and it's the only way, and you will listen and you will receive and absorb, and the other way is it must be a dialogue. And that kind of teaching goes right back to Plato and Aristotle, where it's about a dialogue. It's about what we are teaching you here is how to think and communicate. And I believe the best education is that, one that allows the voice, even if it is a naive or ignorant voice. It allows it to be heard, because then it becomes a learning experience. And as soon as you shut people up and make them just receive, or worse still, which happens in some schools, recite. That's not education. That's parroting. I remember being taught that. I taught my bonds and my times table like that, and I can still say, 6 8 is 48. we all learned that. That's valuable because you can access it immediately. But that's probably about the only thing where it is useful. Everywhere else, particularly with the kind of world we have now, where information is accessible very easily, it's about a critical ability to absorb and process and have a dialogue about it. And I think that what happens, bringing it back to the lesson, is that this professor is very dictatorial, isn't he, in terms of what is right and what is wrong. And it's this way and the only way. Remember this, note it, what does he say, note it carefully and remember it till the day you die. Sort of almost wagging his finger.
Can I take 2 2s away from 3 3s? And 2 figures from 4 numbers and 3 numbers from 1 unit?
No, you cannot.
But why not?
Just because.
Because why is this all the same?
That's just the way things are. It can't be explained. That's the danger. It's one of the pitfalls of education. It doesn't become education, it becomes something else.
I'm just thinking about, you were speaking about how this play was created within a backdrop of a war, and now it's being staged within the backdrop, and we're not equating war to the pandemic, but of another very absurd time of uncertainty that also challenged how teachers teach, right?
Exactly.
How now we're not in the classroom setting, now we have to go onto online learning, And it's really now starting to highlight some of the bigger challenges that we face within the country in terms of access. How many students have access to laptops, to cell phones? And if they do, how many of them have data? And if they do get data from the schools, how many of them live in areas where that network actually works? And as theatre makers, I'm sure you're also faced with the big challenge of how do we create work within a pandemic context? I just want to know, as creatives, how did you soldier through that? And I know that you did soldier through, because here you are today with the courage and the strength of a beautiful play. So how did you survive that pandemic or create during the pandemic?
Well, I'll kick off there because, I had a fantastic year lined up with 3 really wonderful productions. And literally just overnight, the plug was pulled, and that was it. Nothing. And I think that probably was the experience that a lot of people had. And so that was very challenging. And I think that the live theatre certainly is still kind of emerging from that. It's lovely to see that it is emerging, but it's slowly waking up and the green shoots are showing again. But it was jolly difficult. I think that fortunately, I'm in a position where I've lived and worked for a long time, so have sufficient savings for not to be financially stressed by it. But I'm sure there are people there were a lot of people who were financially stressed by it, as there were in other spheres of work. But live entertainment probably was hit harder than anywhere else, with possible exception of the restaurant industry.
How was that for you, Lihle?
The pandemic was really hard. It was really, really hard because I was working on something with friends, and we were set to travel with it, and then we couldn't. And luckily enough, we were able to perform it just for one night. They literally just only gave us one night at the Soweto Theatre. But obviously restricted audience and all of that. And I think also what just also made it difficult, it was also just a bit far. And what didn't bring audience in as much was because a lot of people now know that a lot of theatre shows are now happening online. They're now creating links, which I found a bit hard, even just for me, even to watch other stuff, because live theatre is theatre for a reason. I've never known theatre to be for a screen. It doesn't. I struggle to connect with it entirely. But I think what it had me start to question and start to have a conversation with was, what if? What can we do? What if, because even the way in which social media and just media in general is beginning to change, what if one day we just never had any theatre spaces anymore, but we still had theatre practitioners? Then what? Then what do we do? Do we then sit in our homes and just mourn the loss of that, or do we continue to try and build somehow?
No, we've got to fight. We've got to fight to keep it, because as I absolutely agree with you. I mean, Fiona and I did a small piece called Green Screen during the pandemic, which was screened and streamed. But the discussions we had at the time is, live is live, and the screen is the screen. And you're doing a performance on screen. You lack all of the huge budget that that a Netflix or a huge production company has to create all of that, all the CGI, all the sound, everything else. Live theatre exists and is exciting because it is dangerous, because it is immediate, because these are live flesh and blood people in front of you.
And the other thing that live theatre does, which online stuff doesn't, is that live theatre takes you into the same space. You end up sitting in the same space with strangers. It's some people that you maybe have come with, but mainly with strangers. And you share a moment of community, even if you don't talk to each other. You share a moment of watching something together. And we all know, as actors, performers, directors, that when you have a nice house, or a reasonable house, or even just a small house who kind of go with something and they connect, you can feel that connection happening. You can feel the connection between them, and you can feel the connection between the performers. And you can start to feel this sort of conversation that happens across the stage and the auditorium. And that doesn't happen when you sit in your home watching a TV screen. Even if it's being broadcast live, there's not a shared community that happens in that moment. And the beauty about live performance is it only happens like that night. And the next night it will happen again, but it will be different. It might not be hugely different, but it is different. I mean, to go to your question in terms of my experience of the pandemic, I moved to the UK, or relocated to the UK a few months, or about just over 6 months before the pandemic started. I had, by design, taken a few months to acclimatize to being in a different country and start to think about what I could do in this place and how I could make work in that place that had value and tapped into what I was doing here, but also would offer value to the UK. And I was just starting to find my feet. I was supposed to take a South African play that had just premiered in the UK called When Swallows Cry by Mike van Kraan, which started its life here in this building. Although I did a new production of it in the UK, and it had been picked up to go to South America, to an international festival in Bogota. So that was supposed to happen 2 weeks after the pandemic started. That obviously fell through. There were various other projects that all sort of just stopped. And so I turned to writing. I mean, I had been writing for a while, but I thought, well, what can I do in the pandemic? I can teach online and I can write. And so I did both of those things. I offered a playwriting course, I did a bit of teaching that could continue online, and I wrote 3 plays, this not being one of them. And I would never write 3 plays in 2 years. But because that was all I was doing, I did write 3 plays, and hopefully there will be fruits of the pandemic that will happen beyond, that will be those plays that will have a life. So I think we all had to adapt, and I think Graham's right. I think theatre particularly had a really challenging time because it literally could not happen, at least not in the way that we all know it to be. And up until very recently, certainly in South Africa, audiences haven't been allowed back into capacity. The audience have been allowed back at 50%, and obviously we'll play to whoever's in front of us on a night, but to play to nice houses and full houses is beneficial for everyone. You get that sense of community and that sense of connection, and so it's just really wonderful to be back in this kind of space and hopefully to have audiences coming to share this moment of community, and then the discussion afterwards, and then to talk, because I think this is a play. The lesson is very much a play. It encourages people to talk about what they just saw, because it is a play where everyone who sits in the theatre might have a slightly different take on it, because of the nature of it being an allegory and it being open to interpretation, which is part of its excitement, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, if it stimulates discussion, if it stimulates debate, discussion, argument, whatever, thought, it's not something that you're going to just receive and walk away from and say, oh, well, that was nice, sweet little kind of story in the theatre. It's not that. It's going to provoke you in one way or another. That's without question.
Well done for your perseverance through the pandemic. You were all very busy. But you really did push through. And just to say, the Market Theatre is at full capacity. So please come so that we have that nice buzz in the space. It is, to my observation, and it might be an incorrect observation, that the South African audience is very much used to, like in terms of their palette, like very realism plays, or if you watch South African dramas, it's always within like a very real life set, and you said we're going to bring an absurdist piece, we're going to play within absurdism, there's going to be metaphors, there are going to be things for you to interpret. We are going to let you decide, but I'm quite curious as to what is the lesson of the lesson for each of you.
Well, I mean, I'll save my lecture on this question. Okay. but my short answer is this. I think you're right. I as an academic, speaking with my academic hat on for a moment, I do think that there's a tendency in South Africa, and if you look back at the sort of big plays of South Africa over many, many years, not all. I mean, Water Albert is a great example of not being kind of realist. The Borpas of the world, the Serafinas of the world, Sizwe Banzi is dead. There are many plays that don't sit in that kind of terrain. You Strike a Woman, You Strike a Rock. But there are a huge number, all of the plays of Athol Fugard, the plays of Paul Slabolevsky, some of the later plays even of John Carney. They sit in a kind of realist terrain, And I think there is something about post-pandemic. What theatre can do really well is be theatrical. It can engage with style, and it can be heightened, and it can be playful, I can tell you that this chair is actually a throne, and or I can pick up this bottle of water, and I can tell you that it is a magical sphere that will take you to another world. And the moment I pass it to you, you're going to become another animal, and you would accept that.
Yes.
Whereas film and TV don't allow those opportunities. And I think, I'm guessing, and I'm hoping actually, that theatre for a while now will become more. We'll do theatre. We'll do the theatrical, because I think that's what theatre does really well, and I think actually an audience really love that when they see it.
Yeah.
Of course, when they see a realist set and they see a kitchen and it looks like a home they recognize, they go, okay, this feels familiar, and they go with it. But I think what theatre can really do is be surprising, be theatrical, and be inventive. And I would love that theatre does more of that, because I think by doing more of it, I think audiences will realize actually going to this thing is much better than sitting at home on my couch watching Netflix.
And they can participate, not in the sense of performing, but they participate in terms of how they receive a piece is co-creative, because not everybody's going to receive the piece in the same way, and in fact it invites that. It invites a variation in how you receive it. It's not dictatorial at all. And I remember going to see a piece that would fall very clearly into a kind of absurdist realm at the National Theatre with my son and his girlfriend, and now his fiancée. And when we came out, she was absolutely furious. She was absolutely burning with anger, because she felt that that the wool had been pulled over her eyes. That she was saying this emperor has no clothes. And we had such a wonderful discussion over dinner afterwards, because she was so passionately anti it, and both my son and I had been quite enchanted by it. And that's what theatre should do. It should be a spark to set the discussion aflame.
I mean, as you speak, Graham, I'm reminded of the first time Graham and I worked together. I was an actor in a production that Graham was also an actor in, called Around the World in 80 Days. It was 5 of us. We traveled the world in production, because it was based on Jules Verne's famous novel, and we traveled the world in a small little stage, particularly here in Johannesburg, and using a table and a pool noodle and a few other props.
And 4 chairs.
At one point we jumped onto an elephant and we raced off into
we were on elephants and trains and boats and sleds and
Sounds like a party.
but it was 5 of us with a table and a few props.
And you're inviting an audience to come along with you and to co-create and to imagine. Let's go back to Shakespeare. I think when we speak of horses, that you see them, printing their proud hooves in the receiving earth. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. That's what an audience is asked to do, not simply to receive, but to co-create.
Yeah.
I even think individually as people, in terms of the ideas around theatre of the absurd, there's a lot of it that actually plays in the mind of humans, but it's never necessarily welcomed into the realistic world, so to say. So once you bring an audience into that space, you also just say to them, hey, the way your mind plays and the way your mind just explores, even in the most absurdest of ideas and thoughts, it's welcome in the space.
So in my take on this style of theatre, the theatre of the absurd, I think, in my academic reading and as a practitioner, I feel like it has to start very ordinary. It has to start in a way that looks very recognizable, very familiar. And the arc of the play, in whichever theatre of the absurd play you look at, then starts to turn on itself, and it starts to change, and it starts to become something else. In the lesson, it starts to, again, in my interpretation and what we've worked for in the rehearsal, pull you into the view of the student and the experience that the student is going through. So it's almost as if the audience become able to see through the eyes of the
Why don't you come when I want you, Mari? It's coming immediately when I call. I'm in charge.
But it has to start looking familiar, looking ordinary, looking quite plain, with humor, with playfulness. But that then sets you off on a path that you go, okay, I recognize this. And then you realize actually what I recognize is far more strange, far more odd, far more absurd, far more weird than perhaps we realize even in our daily life.
I also want to take us back to a question we had earlier. As you were speaking, it came to mind because we're speaking about like creating theatre in different and new ways, right? Post-pandemic, what are the other approaches that we can take to it? You were speaking about being a student and how that could also feel very like an isolating experience, like there's no sense of community, you're just a number, you're one of many. What do you think are some of the teaching methods or practices that could be implemented in 2022 in classrooms within the education sector that would be way more fruitful and engaging and interactive outside of tutorials as well? I know those help, but what do you think would feel more liberating for students so that they can ask, engage, and apply some critical thinking?
I think it would be somehow, in some shape, manner, or form, making what is in the textbooks physically applied, if I can put it that way, to allow the students to be like, okay, don't just sit on your chairs for an entire 45 minutes, but now let's get up and let's practicalize this piece of work, but also show me how you understand it or what has sat with you and what has resonated with you. Like, let's give back based on the knowledge that we've been able to receive, and also just allowing language as well to play, allowing others to be like, I heard you, and this is how I've understood it, but in my returning it back and sharing my understanding, can I also bring parts of me into it? Can I bring my language into it? Can I bring if I turn around physically, it's because I understood it in this way. This is my thinking, and just allowing then these things to then link into the other and link into the other, and just that physical work as well. I really do think the body and the mind need to come together somehow, and yeah.
I mean, Fiona was saying just the other day that she had read an article about exactly what, the idea of having to sit in a chair for a very long time and absorb knowledge in that way. And, being a 10, 12, 14, 18-year-old, sitting in a chair for a very long time to absorb knowledge, it's a very strange idea, actually. That's how we're going. We've normalized it entirely, but that's how learning happens. Yeah. You sit there and I talk, and then you'll get the knowledge. And I'm oversimplifying, but I think there's sort of questions around how that happens. Why it happens like that.
Well, there are. I think that my experience of teaching maths, which wasn't a particularly happy experience, because I was aware that there were a lot of people who were being taught in schools who didn't want to learn it, weren't interested in learning it, and frustrating the teacher, because I always used to say I feel like a sheepdog that is trying to get a flock of sheep through a small gate, and I'm just running around snapping at the heels of the ones that aren't, trying to get them all through in time before the end of the year. Oh, most exhausting thing. And there's a certain amount of stuff that they have to receive and understand. And one must acknowledge that participation and debate and what I think about it is very important, but there are also certain principles and certain elements of education that have to be assimilated. And as a teacher, you have to, it's your responsibility to help the students to assimilate it. So it can't always just be anything goes. Do you know what I mean?
I actually remember
finding the balance between these are the key concepts that they must understand, but then also how do I create a space for
you to engage with them and then fully understand them.
And I'd like to pick up on something that Lihle also just mentioned, which is language. We have 11 official languages in South Africa. We know the politics of what it means to learn in a particular language in this country, because there was a whole 1976 uprising because of it. We understand Bantu education and the legacy of that. And I know a younger generation maybe doesn't feel like that's connected to them and so on, but it absolutely is. And I know it's complicated, but because we live in a country with 11 official languages, and I've experienced this being an educator and a lecturer at WITS, the moment someone switches into their mother tongue, their opportunity to learn becomes so much greater. And it's a very hard thing, because how do you tailor to 11 official languages? It's a very difficult thing. And then how do you accept that the lingua franca of the world is English? So what's the politics of that? But I think those are really complex questions, and I think the play tries to pick up on some of those, and we've certainly tried to land some of the points and the complexity of what it means to learn in a language that's not your mother tongue. So, I mean, I don't have answers. I think there are a lot of questions that come out of recognizing that we have a very complex context that we come from in this country.
And I do wonder if perhaps that's the first step of decolonizing the education system, is making efforts to make education accessible in different languages, which is a huge task. But maybe we, measure the massiveness of the task against the benefit of what that will do within the education system. Okay. So what are some of the challenges that you're currently facing within the industry?
Funding.
Yeah.
Funding.
But it's interesting you should say funding. When you spoke about the theatre of the absurd and how we often see work within realism, I've watched a play. I watched a play recently abroad, and it was an absurdist piece as well. And the absurd things that happen in your mind usually aren't very realistic. And so when you express that, if it's 1,000 balls falling from the air, then you can say, yes, it's 1,000 balls falling in the air. If you have the budget for 1,000 balls to come out from the roof and fall onto the stage. So funding does play a big part in terms of what is and what isn't possible and what you can produce.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a big challenge. I think where there is some money around, and it is about where that money goes and how that money is used. I also think, one of the things that theatre can do is it can do a lot with very little. But it's easy to say that, you've got to get audience. I mean, it's got to become a kind of holistic relationship between the audience who are coming to watch stuff, the makers who are making stuff for an audience, rather than perhaps what sometimes happens, which is artists making only for themselves, which happens in every context in different times and places. So funding is a big challenge.
Funding is funding.
Well, I mean, I suppose to sort of extrapolate a little bit, I mean, people look at a fantastic little theatre production that's happening, and they say, but half the world doesn't know about it. Certainly half the world who would come to see it, might be interested in see it, doesn't know about it. And so you have to have a marketing budget. And yes, there's a certain amount of social media and focused marketing that you can do, but it actually, the revenue, the return on investment for what you have to spend on a radio spot, 20 screenings of a radio spot on one single program can wipe out your theatre sales from an entire full house. So the economics of live theatre are very challenging, and that's not just here, particularly so here, but it's not, it's true everywhere in the world. If you have a centre like New York where people they'll go to tickets in Times Square, or they'll go to Leicester Square and see what cheap tickets they can get, and they know the National Theatre's there. They go to the National Theatre because of the National Theatre, see what's on. Those places are kind of a step ahead because it's an institution. But in South Africa it's very difficult because we don't have that.
I mean, I believe, and this is not necessarily something artists have to do, it's something that everyone kind of has to do, and it has to be led by a space like the Market Theatre and by other spaces across the country. And it has to be led by the education system and the government as well, and that is that theatre needs to become part of everyday life.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean selling tickets to come to a show or expensive tickets coming to a show. It also means having a student who's coming to the lab, whose grandmother is sitting in KZN and is knows about what the lab does and is chuffed that, and it can talk to her friends and say, my grandson is studying at the lab. And that's part of being a part of everyday life. It's going to watch something and the next day sitting across an office desk and having a conversation of, oh, last night I went to that, and oh, I would like to go to that, or going to a book club and going, next week we're not going to go to the book club, or next month we're not going to the book club, we're going to watch this book that's been adapted into a play, and so on. And I think that's where other countries and contexts have managed to, over time and with lots of resources and lots of leadership, be able to build a culture of going to the theatre as part of everyday life.
Audience development, I mean, that is...
But it also needs to start in the schools. Like if the schooling system is not allowing arts and culture to be part of the terrain, and there's a politics of doing arts or going, being part of a play or not, or whatever, then people are not introduced to it at an early age, and then you're having to win them back or win them to something as adults, and that's also hard.
Yeah, because they didn't grow in it. They didn't grow within that culture.
Many people have encountered it. I've never seen a play. Never seen a play.
I do know that in a lot of schools within South Africa, whenever it's time for arts and culture, we'd rather have a maths lesson because maths is going to get you further than arts. Maybe also in terms of like how deeply valued and recognized is arts and culture.
Well, you see, it's such an inaccurate perception that, in my view. My whole attitude towards education has changed over the years. That we shouldn't be teaching our children that you must take the maths and science. Take maths and science if you're good at it and that's what you really want to do. But if you want to open up your thinking and you want to open up avenues for employment, study philosophy, study English, study history, study the world.
Where will you get employed in philosophy?
I'm sorry. Can I ask Lihle a quick question? I mean, Lihle, because you started quite young in art. Where did that come from? Was it someone in the family that encouraged you, or what was the interest?
I actually really love telling the story every time I'm asked a question like that. My mother started it, actually. I was 5 years old, and I was just a little kid just playing and doing ordinary stuff, and I guess because of who my mother is and what her profession is, she just didn't want children, and I guess just her experiences of the world before her children came into it. She knew that she wanted children who were going to be able to stand up for themselves and stand their ground and fight in some way, in the ways that she did before we came. So when I arrived, she looked at me and said, I don't want a child that can't speak. Even if mom is not there to hold your hand, even if mom is not at the school and there's this bully that is saying something and you know that you have said the right thing and it's right, So she put me into a drama academy, but she put me there just so that I could be confident. So I joined the Helen O'Grady Drama Academy, and the kids there, it was to train us to be able to stand and speak confidently. Even if, we believed that frogs can fly. I can say frogs can fly and I can believe in it confidently. Yeah. And I think that space and that world, so it's going there on weekends and then going to school and experiencing that and knowing that, oh my gosh, I wish this was school every day. I wish I did maths here. I wish we had our physical education here in this space. I wanna pretend that I can crawl, that I can beat a lion or something. I just want to do it in this space. I want to become in this space, and that's where it started. That even when I was done and when I left the academy after 8 years, I knew that I wanted to grow the seed that my mother had planted. So
what I'm hearing, it's not just like about talent, but it's a life skill that you have, that you're carrying, to be confident, to be able to speak for yourself in the world. I feel like we could go on forever because there's so much to say. This play is packed. But I'm going to ask you to just wrap up the lesson in one word. One word that describes the lesson, and then we're going to get into our burning questions. I know it's many things, but you can find one word.
Captivating.
I was going to say fascinating.
Layered.
I'd say provoking, because it's provoked a lot of thoughts and questions about how we can do things differently when it comes to education, when it comes to creating art. And now on a more light-hearted note, I have a couple of burning questions for you.
Oh dear.
And I'm going to encourage, please, we've had a lot of time for deep thoughts and like analysis and academic commentary,
Or just quick fire answers?
Quick fire answers.
Ooh.
This is supposed to be fun. Don't overdo it.
Okay.
Don't overthink it, I mean.
Okay.
All right. I will start with Mr. Director. What are the most important 3 skills you look for in an actor? 1.
You.
We on 2.
Ooh, no. I didn't say the hard question. Being nice to work with. Being open. And,
Number 3.
I mean, understanding, like the craft of theatre.
Between the 3 cast members that you have, Fiona included, who tested your patience the most?
Well, that's a very unfair question, but I mean, purely, no one tested my patience,
how nice. What a
the amount of words that Graham had to get under his belt for this project meant that we had to be very patient with holding the fact that there's someone in the room who's been given a very, very big task. I mean, as Graham rightly put it, the hardest set of words he's had to learn in 40 years.
You're very gracious.
So that's my answer.
You guys have been very good.
Graham with a
warm
compliment.
hands. I think this answers why are you a director? Why are you a director?
I suppose because it was like a calling. And I know that sounds quite trite, but I feel like from a very early age, and I've told this story before, but in other places, but from a very early age, I kind of felt like I could see something and I wanted to manifest it in a physical space. And I do feel like I have an interest and a calling in enabling others, and I think directing in some way is about doing exactly that. So it felt like it just fitted for me.
And what was the most challenging thing about directing the lesson?
The arc of the play. It's very hard, and we're still wrestling with that, because it's got this impossible arc in 70 minutes. It goes from this sort of playful space that feels sort of ordinary and familiar, and by the end of it, not to give anything away, it becomes something completely different, stylistically heightened and very, very dark and sinister.
Almost unrecognizable.
Yeah, and so to get that arc in a way that feels like it flows, very hard.
Yeah. Are there any hidden messages in the play? And if so, what are they?
I wouldn't say hidden messages, but I think depending on where an audience come from and where they are in their life, I think they will read different things into the play that are beyond what we've discussed in the rehearsal room. And that's the nature of it being an allegory. It's open to interpretation.
Yeah. And I also think that's the beauty of it.
Absolutely. That's what makes allegory so wonderful, is that a mother and a daughter can sit in a space, watch the same play, and the mother will think it's about this, and the daughter will go, no, it's about that.
Well, thank you so much. Graham, your turn.
No.
Swift on the feet. What is your favorite memory made with your fellow cast members?
Well, I think sitting around a table, reading the play, and discovering the humor in it. We giggled a lot at how absurd it was and how recognizable the absurdity was, and I think that was fun.
On a more spicy note, what's the most scandalous photo you have on your phone?
Oh my word! Well, it's not spicy actually. I would say the most scandalous photo on my phone was a photo I took for the insurance company when robbers smashed my front door down and splintered the door. That's scandalous in my view.
That was in January, days like a day before we read the
Absolutely.
Fiona and
I interrupted them, and I had a coffee mug in my hand, and I said, "No, come on!" And then I ran away.
Have you ever been caught checking someone out?
I would never.
And what's the most inappropriate time you've been caught laughing?
Oh, well, corpsing on stage is just an absolute no-no. But sometimes, inevitably, it happens when something goes wrong, and it's the most terrifying thing, because you want to get a grip, because it's not good, So
define
you get
corpsing for-
because corpsing is laughing, is getting the giggles
Out of character.
and getting the giggles on stage, and you get angry with yourself, and the angrier you get, the more you want to laugh. It's a terrible thing. It's a physical reaction.
See it.
And if the audience can see it and they laugh too, and that makes you want to laugh even more. And it's terrible.
That brings quite
Terrible.
nicely to the next question.
Yeah.
What are some of your worst habits during rehearsal? I feel like corpsing should be the ultimate worst.
No, well, I suppose if you're going to corpse, get it over in rehearsals.
Better than-
Get it over with.
Okay, and we know you've had like the most lines, but between the three of you, including Fiona, who had their lines down first?
Oh, me, definitely.
Oh wow.
But I can tell you who it was.
No, hang on. I think I've got to look at this from a mathematician's point of view. So if you take the number of words that I have, the number of words that Lihle has, and the number of words that Fiona have, I definitely learned mine first.
Oh, what an equation. Lihle, we answer you.
I bite my tongue.
Ooh, okay.
What
go.
do you think are the three most important skills an actor should have?
The ability to be able to accept whatever the other actor is going to give you and not rely solely on what you've prepared for yourself. The ability to be able to play and just trust the story beyond what you know and what your strengths are. The third one, it's hard. Don't take yourself too seriously.
I can see how this worked.
As you were talking, I would go back to my answer.
these
I'm
are not your burning
correcting my answer.
It's burning like literally.
I'm correcting my answer. Actually, what's really important to me is I'm replacing this with being open. Is actually like having genuine thought about what they're doing and actually pushing back, because you want a space where there's some pushback. It depends. You don't want a huge amount of pushback, but you want some pushback. So because that's where the real conversation sits. Anyway, I interrupted. Sorry.
So what message do you wish to portray through the character that you're playing in the lesson?
The message that I want to portray through the character, that is a very, very interesting question. I think it would be, it's okay to get up and try to fight.
And what are you most grateful for regarding, just being a part of the cast and being a part of the lesson?
I'm grateful to have been in a space that I've never been in before, and I'm going to be very open in saying I've never worked with white people in a space ever, actually. So even just getting into that, for me, there was a lot that I had to slowly but surely allow myself to settle into. Otherwise, I was just going to rob myself of the entire experience. And I think one of the moments I was really grateful for was the one-on-one that I had with Greg. Because I think maybe he noticed.
He was the professor.
I think maybe he noticed that at some point I didn't really say much, and it was because of the unfamiliar space, that I've never worked in. But to be able to sit with him and be like, well, actually during Fees Must Fall, I was there when this happened in my university and this and that. To be allowed that space to engage in ways that I never thought I was going to be able to, because I had never imagined that I'd ever get the opportunity or for a door to be opened where white people can see a young black girl and decide, can we work with you? And can we create something with you? So, yeah.
What are some of the rituals that you do when you get into character before you perform?
I come into a space, I put on sounds, necessarily not music per se, but sounds that... Instrumentals a little bit, that help me move. Because for me, the work really just starts in the body, energy. So I come into the space and I move. I move, I stretch, I plie, I puree, so I definitely do all of that. I loosen up my body, because if my body is rigid, then very little is going to come out of here, out of my mouth. It's that first, and then recognizing everybody else in the space after I've been able to recognize myself in it, and then then just rolling with the next step as it goes.
Who's your favorite performer in South Africa?
My favorite performer in South
You're
Africa.
not allowed to say yourself.
Definitely Masasa Mbangeni. Masasa Mbangeni, not just because of how amazing she is, but just because of how, also because of her.
My student.
Ooh, but also just how present she is and how she always reminds herself to be here and not rob herself of every single moment. Even if it's to step into a space, and yes, mistakes maybe were made, or yes, maybe we corpsed on stage, but it's to tell yourself that I'm here and let the moment happen and let me feel it fully, because this won't happen again in the same way tomorrow.
She's present.
She's very here.
Who do you reckon absolutely has your back in life?
My mom.
You want to say a shout out, Mom?
I love you so much. You are my heart. You are the catalyst for what I do and where I've come from and where I'm headed. And I wouldn't be here if you did not see me at that young age.
Copy paste for the Oscars. What do you look for in a script?
Growth.
Closed or open auditions?
Closed.
What is your go-to song now that we know you love some instruments and music and moving?
I've got two. Okay, thank you. It's Abusey Junction, Kokoroko, and it's also Inja by Zoe Modiga.
Apple Music, Spotify, find them. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much. I've had a lesson, more than one, just through the work that you've done, not just on this play, but the work that you've done prior and how it has brought you to this moment. And we are very excited to watch tomorrow and to enjoy that which you've cooked up for us. And so you better come through and watch as well. And we'll see you again on another episode of Beyond the Story. We know that you have enjoyed the show, so please do the right thing. Subscribe to our channel, comment, engage. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.